This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. This episode is pretty complicated and refers to people and issues we've already discussed, especially in the last episode. It might be helpful to go back and start at the beginning of Season 6 before listening to this one. This is Segregation Academies, Part 2. There's an obscure Bible story that I think about a lot. It's in 2 Samuel 24. It involves King David.
Man after God's own heart.
King of Israel and a mighty warrior. David gets punished by God for counting the number of people in his army, something he wasn't supposed to do. Soon after that, David's prophet gives him a message.
Build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor that belongs to Araunah the Jebusite.
So, following instructions, David goes to Araunah and offers to buy the land. Araunah meets the king and says,
"You want to buy the land? No, just take it. In fact, since you're going to build an altar to the Lord, I'll give you oxen to offer, and you can bust up their yokes and use the wood for your fire."
Score? David just strutted in and God told him to make an altar, and here's this guy going to just give him all the supplies he needs. Easy. But David does something striking. He says,
"No, I will buy them from you at full price. I won't offer to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing."
He won't do it. David will not take this gift of free land and oxen because he believes that a sacrifice should cost him something. Sacrifice, in other words, requires sacrifice. If he took Araunah's generous offer, it wouldn't be a sacrifice. Now, this story seems a little inconsequential, but the land that David purchased would one day become the site of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That land, the threshing floor that David refused to get for free, became the holiest site in Judaism. I tell you that story because I think one of the things evangelicals like me struggle with is giving God something at full price. We want recognition in return, or a tax write-off for our gifts, or to get a deal somehow. But sacrifice requires sacrifice. Today, we're going to continue where we left off in the last episode, as we wrestle with the complicated legacy of segregation academies. Many of us believe that segregation is evil, that people of every race are made in the image of God. But if we were challenged to sacrifice for that belief, would we? You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. In the previous episode, I talked about how Thomas Jefferson's vision of a country run by small farmers was bound to break down as the nation became more complex and intertwined, as citizens demanded their rights as well as protections in the workplace, how the Supreme Court issued new rulings that placed limitations on religious expression in public schools and required those schools to integrate racially. Here is an important nugget. Federal desegregation efforts were largely focused on the South because racism there was so blatant. The American South suffered from a sort of inferiority complex. There's this sense that the South is looked down upon by the rest of the country, that it's seen as backwards. Now, this is something that the South was keenly aware of in the 1960s, including Senator John Stennis from Mississippi. Stennis felt this in spades, that the South was being targeted in ways that the North was not. And he kind of had a point there. Some laws were explicitly enforced in the South and not in the North. You might say to me, now, that's because the South is the racist part of the country. But it turns out that the North was racist too. It just manifested differently. This comes down to an interesting distinction: de facto segregation versus de jure segregation. De jure segregation is the kind we're most familiar with because it's obvious. Signs spelling out specific bathrooms for white people and for black people, or separate schools, lynchings when a black man looked the wrong way at a white woman, obvious racism, often backed by law or custom. Then there is de facto segregation, where it's a little more hidden. Take a neighborhood in a northern city like Chicago. At this time, a black person couldn't get a loan to buy a home in a white neighborhood, but they might be able to get a loan in an area that was already predominantly black. Or locals might intimidate black people if they wanted to, say, rent an apartment in a white neighborhood. When government-backed home loans were made during the New Deal, black people could get them in urban areas, while white people could get them really anywhere. The FHA refused to insure black homes that weren't in black neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods were sometimes near undesirable locations like factories or waste facilities, and often far away from jobs. Thus, through the mechanics of housing, neighborhoods were segregated, without all the signs and lynching. The North used banking and housing systems to keep people physically apart. This is a practice known as redlining. This practice in the North didn't just kind of stay with housing. It carried over into schools. If all the black people were gathered together into black-only neighborhoods, then they wouldn't be in the same school districts with white people, just by virtue of where they lived. This, of course, was by design. You didn't need to intimidate black people from entering white schools because they simply weren't in the same districts. Which brings us around to how public schools are funded. Now picture a school building.
Welcome to Random Chicago High School.
This school is located inside of an imaginary district. We'll call it Smith School District. How does Random Chicago High School get money to keep the lights on, or hire teachers, or buy books? In many places in the United States, schools are funded by local taxes. Random Chicago High School is in a predominantly black neighborhood. And because of redlining, there are fewer jobs here. And because of discriminating hiring practices, people working in the district are paid less than their white counterparts. So when tax time comes around, there's not much money collected in Smith's school district, meaning they can't hire experienced teachers or update facilities. Okay, so let's go across town. In a different school district is White People High School. WP High is located in an affluent white district.
My son is on the lacrosse team.
Since that school is in a wealthy neighborhood, and we'll assume that these rich people pay their taxes, come tax time, there is plenty of money for new buildings, hiring coaches, and competing for top-tier teaching staff. In other words, the money collected in wealthy neighborhoods stays in wealthy neighborhoods.
My kids get only the finest education. Their yellow pencils are gold-plated.
Meaning that schools in poor neighborhoods are often underfunded, while schools in the wealthiest neighborhoods attract better teachers and nicer amenities. This is, by the way, not true everywhere. For example, Wyoming, the state I live in, pools all state funds and distributes it from a central hub to avoid this exact problem. For as backwards as we are here in Wyoming, we sometimes live up to our slogan as the equality state. So just like in the South, many school districts in the North were actually segregated, just not officially. In the South, white people kept black people out of schools through intimidation and violence, de jure segregation. In the North, they did it through economics and drawing imaginary lines, which means white people might not actually have to confront their own racism every day, or even notice that this was happening. De facto segregation. There, segregation was accomplished by keeping neighborhoods apart through redlining. White kids and black kids just might not go to school together in places like Chicago, Cleveland, or Boston in the 1960s. Not by law per se, but by forcing black people into certain neighborhoods. Mississippi Senator John Stennis, a clear racist and carrier of the banner of the benighted South, saw this de facto segregation and cried foul. The South was being targeted. Schools there were losing their tax-exempt status for being segregated, but enforcement didn't carry over to the North. So he and his followers tried a number of tricks. One was pretty clear-cut. The Mississippi Attorney General sent out 2,800 letters to states' lawyers instructing them to file lawsuits in the North and West to desegregate their schools. That's right. He wanted lawyers from the South to force schools in the North to desegregate. He said,
"The Southern segregationist cause would get many new supporters in the North if the government ever moved with determination against Yankee Jim Crow."
As historian Joseph Crespino wrote,
The idea, of course, was not to desegregate northern school districts, but to arouse Northerners against the federal guidelines, sparking a backlash against Northern whites that might relieve pressure on the South.
in other words, Stennis and his friends figured out that if they could get the North to come to terms with their own racism and feel the pressure of integration for themselves, then they could take attention off of the South. The lawsuits were just one step in that process. Another was the various Stennis amendments, which advocated that the South and North should be treated the same in terms of desegregation. And Stennis didn't need the law to pass to do that. He just had to convince Northern liberals of their complicity in de facto segregation, and then let their guilty consciences do the rest. He did it by simply pointing out through statistics in his speeches how the North was also segregated. And those statistics did not look good. The tactic worked. Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff was already traveling the country denouncing federal hesitation in fighting de facto segregation when he heard about the Stennis Amendment. He delivered a speech on the Senate floor in 1970. White flight was leaving cities without work, while housing fell into disrepair and whites moved to the suburbs. 80% of new jobs created in the last 2 decades were in the suburbs, where black people were prevented from living. He said,
"We must realize that in a segregated society, the society isn't segregated because the schools are segregated.
Instead, schools were segregated
Because you've got a segregated society."
This left lawmakers with a tough decision. It's not enough to simply desegregate society. Make laws that you can't stop black people from using formerly white schools. It wouldn't accomplish anything in de facto neighborhoods. They didn't live near each other, so this kind of thing wouldn't change the makeup of classrooms. It would be impractical to move people's homes to shuffle who lived in which neighborhood. Instead, they brought in school buses, purposely transporting white students to schools in black neighborhoods and black students to schools in white neighborhoods, thereby achieving mixed schools. This practice was derogatorily named forced busing, and people did not like it. In some places like Boston and Michigan, the battles over this practice turned violent. It forced northern schools to put their money where their mouth was. Sure, it was easy for them to say that they wanted desegregated schools, but it was something entirely different when they had to send their white kids to an underfunded inner city school. This is why we covered the story of King David buying the threshing floor. He didn't want to just pay lip service to his convictions. Instead, he made a sacrifice. What forced busing did was push white Northerners who talked about the evils of racism to sacrifice something of their own. Something, by the way, I think we humans hate to do. Because now you're taking white kids,
Like my son Brandon.
like Brandon, who were used to their well-funded schools with chess teams and shiny new buildings, and transporting them to historically underfunded schools in black neighborhoods.
Isn't that a long bus ride?
Yes, it is. Kids could spend an hour or two just sitting on the bus going back and forth to school.
Of course, he'll still have teachers educated at the best schools, right?
Maybe, but formerly black school districts might still be strapped for cash. The building could be in a shambles. Because remember, in a lot of school districts, local tax dollars went to fund local schools. So schools that were in a poor neighborhood didn't receive good funding. So when you're sending white students across town to a poor neighborhood, the school's probably not going to be in good shape.
But won't it be unsafe for him there?
Possibly, because now you're taking suburban kids and placing them, potentially, in inner city environments. Let's pretend that the white family in question isn't even really racist, and they're lower middle class.
So, only a small yacht.
No yacht at all. A nice family, they work hard, and they don't think they have a racist bone in their bodies. This busing move costs them something. They suddenly come face to face with what it was like for black students to attend underfunded schools. And when white parents tasted what black parents had long endured, they weren't having it. And you guessed it, attendance in private schools exploded. When we return, we'll tie together all the loose ends of the last episode and this one. Why do we so often connect evangelicals with large followings with the private Christian school movement? And why do we think of them as racist? While you listen to the ads, consider finding the show on Venmo at Truce Podcast and helping me make this program. Okay, here come the ads. Welcome back to Truce. Now, let's get into some sticky territory. The federal government cracked down hard on Southern racism. According to historian Joseph Crespino, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act drained real money from schools in Mississippi. In December of 1967, the Secretary of the Army threatened to stop payments to Mississippi for land in that state if schools were not up to desegregation standards. By the 68-69 school year, 37 school districts failed those standards, meaning they lost more than $9 million in federal funds. The federal government was laying on pressure, and real dollars were at stake. But the South kept zigging and zagging. They want us to integrate schools, then we'll send our kids to private schools. So then, the government went after segregation academies. Remember, the reason these schools believed that they didn't have to comply with the law was because they didn't receive federal funding, except for that sneak subsidy they got by being tax-exempt. In January of 1970, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary Robert Finch urged the U.S. Treasury Department to wipe out tax exemptions for Southern segregation academies. As you can imagine, this caused a panic. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, who rallied Southerners around President Nixon, went on the warpath. He met with Nixon in February of 1970 and was assured that the administration supported tax exemptions for schools, which they argued was not a subsidy. They believed that tax exemptions were actually acts of benevolent neutrality. As Crespino wrote,
tax exemptions were not federal subsidies, the administration argued, but rather mere tools that the government used to promote diversity in areas that were oftentimes beneficial to society at large, but were beyond the scope of the government to regulate or judge.
This didn't stop the Nixon administration from being accused of partnering with white supremacists. So, a few months later, they changed their minds and targeted segregation academies, turning up the heat. By 1970, we had public schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, and segregation academies with bleed over across some categories. So yes, there were Christian segregation academies. If you look at the number of private schools in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you see dramatic changes. More and more children attended them, though for different reasons. In 1954, only 123 non-Catholic Christian schools existed in the United States. By 1981, there were roughly 18,000, with 2 million students, which sounds big but is kind of small compared to the total population of kids attending school. This influx was due in part to changes in how religion would be expressed in public school settings, but also shifts in curriculum. Some parents objected to having their kids taking sex ed, which was increasingly required material, or teaching evolution as fact. The school environment in the 70s was very different from what it had been in the 50s, as drugs, hippies, protesters, and alternative ideas made the news. Peak church attendance in America had passed. Meanwhile, the American Christian subculture ballooned through religious television and Christian books. The more uncertain the world got, the more Christians sought the comfort of the bubble, where students were taught to pray and read the Bible in private schools, and were shielded from controversial curricula. But the rise of Protestant schools had unfortunate timing. It came just as racist parents opted for segregation academies. And to make it confusing, there was crossover. Some segregation academies sold themselves as Christian. And it's difficult to calculate how many were just Protestant and how many existed for segregation reasons and how many signed up for both. That distinction only got more confusing. In 1970, Randolph Thrower, the IRS commissioner, announced that the Internal Revenue Service had no intention of going after religious schools. This was a revelation for racists, a loophole just waiting to be exploited. Take, for example, the Central Holmes Academy in Lexington, Mississippi. 1 year earlier, they put out a fundraising letter boasting that any donations to them would be tax deductible. And if you didn't give,
there will be many, many students whose minds and bodies are just as pure as those of any of their classmates and playmates, who, for financial reasons alone, will be forced into one of the intolerable or repugnant other schools, or into dropping out of school entirely.
This clearly racist school was just one of many that learned about the new loophole. The IRS said it was not going after religious institutions, so they changed their name to the Central Holmes Christian Academy. See what they did there? Name change and maybe all your sins are overlooked? They were not the only ones. And now you had not only public schools, Catholic schools, Christian schools, segregation academies, and Christian segregation academies, but you also had segregation academies pretending to be Christian schools, and some of them taught no religious content at all. And the issue grew even more muddled. Protestant schools that were not racist faced an obstacle. That fundraising letter from Central Holmes Christian Academy was used in a Supreme Court case that determined that any private school that wanted tax-exempt status and had been created after schools were ordered to desegregate had to prove that they were not racist. Which sounds easy, but really, it's not.
As Washington and the IRS begins to really put their heads together, as the Supreme Court finally by the 1970s says, this has to stop. How can we enforce school segregation in a way that sticks?
This is Rick Perlstein, historian and author of Reaganland and the Invisible Bridge.
Jimmy Carter's IRS commissioner, a very kind of mild-mannered rationalist bureaucrat named Jerome Kurtz, comes up with a set of standards. If you're in a district that is under a segregation order or has had a segregation controversy, you have to either have a percentage of African Americans in your school that has some relationship to the amount of African Americans in the area around the schools, or you have to show us that you're taking that fraught phrase, affirmative action, to try to recruit them.
As one can imagine, this ruffled a lot of feathers.
A bunch of things happen as a result. First of all, there are a lot of segregationists out there and they freak out. One of them is Bob Jones III, right, who obviously takes his right to keep black and white students from dating each other all the way to the Supreme Court a little while after this.
I'll cover that soon. It deserves its own mini episode.
All sorts of private schools, not just religious schools, but, Montessori schools, for example, the organization of Montessori schools say this is just, too burdensome. It's burdensome regulation. We can't afford it. Some of the schools are, Christian schools are so small that, they say, we're literally 20 kids in a church basement.
And maybe they didn't have the resources to rise to the occasion. And don't get too riled up because it's hard to prove that you're not racist. Let's pretend that you've set up a school within the window of scrutiny. You sincerely want to teach the Bible, to pray, to welcome students of all races. That's not good enough. You would have had to actively recruit black children to attend. Now, this sounds easy, but because of de facto segregation, it wasn't. If you set your school up in a white neighborhood, because of de facto segregation, there may not be black kids in your region. Also, many black people were rightfully suspicious of Christian schools since they came about at basically the same time as segregation academies. Some of them, actually a lot of them, were segregation academies. By 1973, Christian schools and segregation academies were seen as synonymous in the eyes of some. This was due in part to a group of liberal Southerners calling themselves the Lamar Society. They sponsored a 2-year study of private Southern schools titled The Schools That Fear Built. They documented the nefarious trickery of some segregation academies that switched their names to sound like Christian schools, but actually taught nothing that a public school wouldn't. And they concluded that,
despite what would seem contrary origins, the schools in practice are so similar as to be indistinguishable.
Of course, those who defended church schools wanted to be clear. Not all Christian schools were segregationist, and it was an error to paint with such a broad brush. Still, even they had to admit that no school was going to be 100% unsullied by racism. Defenders of Christian schools said that to pin the creation of Christian schools solely on racism was to ignore all the other major societal upheavals in the 1960s and 70s. Then, in 1975, the IRS required that private schools advertise that they had a non-discrimination policy, to put it on their brochures and catalogs, and to advertise in the media.
But another thing that happens that's a little more kind of frightening and kind of plays into the rise of the religious right is that this becomes the locus of some pretty nutty conspiracy theories.
And as we know, American Christians were primed for conspiracy theories, believing that secular humanists were systematically trying to wipe religion from public life. And some of them believed that the end of the world was coming soon, ushered in by a one-world government. This made them take the logical leap that the government wasn't going to stop at closing down segregation academies, that next, they'd come for churches. And here's the thing, some segregation academies operated out of churches, and those churches might have run their school as part of their organization, instead of its own organization. If the segregation academy lost its tax-exempt status, so would the church. No tax-exempt status, and it would be much harder to fund a local church. Listen, I am not making excuses for segregation. It's clearly a wicked practice, but I want you to follow the logic. Schools, churches, and taxes were intimately connected. If the IRS went after schools, some people made the leap to believing that the government would soon come after churches. They didn't, but that's the way the logic worked. And it allowed for some public Christians to make strange bedfellows, not necessarily defending segregation, though some did, but partnering with segregationists to protect their own tax-exempt status. The government was getting bigger and more involved in the lives of everyday people, sliding away from that Jeffersonian ideal that, let's face it, was way too simplistic. Now, some evangelicals worried that the government wouldn't stop at shutting down segregation academies. If they could revoke tax exemption from those schools, surely they could revoke it from churches as well. We evangelicals love a slippery slope. Today, sure, they might come for racism. But what if tomorrow the government says we have to ordain certain kinds of people, or risk losing our exemption, or preach a certain thing? Do you see the slippery slope there? This phenomenon was clearly about race, but underwriting the culture war was an economic concern. Would churches maintain their tax-exempt status? In your rage against racism, don't miss that. Evangelicals, actually, I think humans in general, love tax exemptions. Churches and other nonprofits rely on them to boost their giving because donors want something back when they donate. They expect a write-off. And if that write-off goes away, so might the donors. So some evangelicals with big followings determined that if the government could revoke nonprofit status over segregation, surely they could do it for other causes as well. According to Rick, the first to sound the alarm about this possibility was the Christian Reconstructionists under R.J. Rushdoony. Remember that guy?
This is where you get figures like R.J. Rushdoony, right, who believes that kind of American civil law should mimic Old Testament biblical law, right? And, one of the things R.J. Rushdoony believes is that, homosexuals should be stoned, right? Which is, never did become an idea that kind of got particularly far within the mainstream. But this other idea, which is that public schools were basically a conspiracy to destroy Christianity, and that people should either go to Christian schools or educate their children at home, becomes extremely influential.
Rushdoony was a minor figure who had some major followers. One of Rushdoony's followers was New Right founding member Paul Weyrich, who submitted a letter of protest to the government.
By this proposal, the IRS is deciding what is right to think and what is wrong, and pronouncing a death penalty on wrong thoughts. I cannot think of anything more totalitarian.
His Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress spread the word, as did the American Conservative Union. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops called the requirements, quote, completely unrealistic, end quote. And then, according to Rick Perlstein, Senator Joe Biden, a Catholic, quote, voted to strike money to regulate private schools from the IRS's authorization, end quote. Jerry Falwell responded, as did Robert Billings. By December of 1978, the IRS had received 150,000 letters of protest, and they decided to hold public hearings on the subject.
And Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and all these people basically used this, well-intentioned reform to descend upon Washington for this extraordinary 3-day hearing.
It was later extended to a 4th day.
In which, the kind of things we see at, Tea Party rallies against Obamacare or, Trump rallies suddenly are unfolding in this federal building, in the Treasury building, and these bureaucrats do not know what hit them.
There were protesters outside with signs reading, "Let God run religious schools, not the IRS." And on the other side, kind of cleverly, "Jim Crow with your own dough." Speeches were given, tracts were handed out, and speakers shouted at each other, leaders from integrated schools and segregated ones. Bob Jones III, a full-blown racist, railed. Interestingly, a black mother said she sent her kids to a private Baptist school because
young men must cut their hair to a certain length, girls can't wear dresses unless they are a certain length. It teaches boys to be gentlemen, it teaches girls to be ladies. What they do in the public schools? No training whatsoever. In Christian schools, you obey.
Do you see how confusing this is? The crowd even called out the fact that the panel holding the hearings was all white. How could the IRS demand integration when they themselves were not integrated? It was a mess. So let's take another breath. Are you still with me? Okay. This brings us to a mighty big claim. One that has gotten a lot of copy and airtime when covering Segregation Academies. And honestly, it's the reason I tried so hard to get away from doing these episodes. Because it means trying to stand up for the historic consensus rather than what sounds like a magic bullet answer for why some evangelicals follow the Republican Party. It's from New Right co-founder and Reconstructionist Paul Weyrich.
What galvanized the Christian community was not abortion, school prayer, or the ERA. I am living witness to that because I was trying to get those people interested in those issues and I utterly failed. What changed their mind was Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian schools, trying to deny them tax-exempt status on the basis of so-called de facto segregation.
This quote has been given a lot of weight, but not with mainstream historians, just with a few Christian ones. Thankfully, historian Daniel K. Williams, author of God's Own Party, was open to talking. And so I asked him about this boast, because Weyrich's claim is disputed by Williams and by people like Rick Perlstein. There is no doubt that race played a big role in bringing some evangelicals to the Republican Party. Again, no doubt. The question is not, was it an issue, but was it the issue, as Weyrich claimed it was.
Some historians, Randall Balmer would probably be foremost among that group, have made the argument that this is really what launched the Christian right. That not only was this a racist move, that is, designed to protect segregated institutions, but it was also the foremost concern for the Christian right. And everything else was an add-on or even a smokescreen to that. The abortion issue came later. What really mattered to conservative evangelicals, Balmer has argued, and others have picked up on this argument, was protecting a segregated institution. I have not taken that interpretation, and I'm not alone in that. There are a number of other historians who have pointed out correctly, I think, that the origins of the Christian right are a lot more complicated than that.
We humans, of course, are not great at complicated matters. We like to believe in a magic bullet, one galvanizing event. Those magic bullet answers get headlines, but context is less sexy.
I think the evidence is overwhelming that there were multiple issues that were all coming together in this constellation. If you had to summarize all of those issues in one, what I would say is there was a perception that the American family, defined, of course, as the nuclear two-parent family, needed to be protected against a secularization of society and government and the sexual revolution, and that they saw secularization and the sexual revolution as going hand in hand. They believed that encompassed things like the Equal Rights Amendment. It included pornography. It included the gay rights movement. It included abortion. All of these things were linked together. Now, included in that mix, though not the most prominent issue, I would argue, was this concern about Christian schools. And I think once we understand that, what motivated the Christian right, we can understand their reaction to this IRS directive. People like Falwell,
Jerry Falwell being the founder of the Moral Majority, Liberty University, and a known televangelist,
had enrolled some African Americans in their schools, though a very small number. I think the number, if I remember correctly, in the late 1970s was about 5 in Falwell's day school out of more than 1,000 students. And similarly had some African Americans in his church. So he was not at the very least, we could say that he was not a diehard segregationist in the way that he was in the 1950s. These were not officially segregated schools. However, they did ally themselves with institutions that were still officially segregated. Bob Jones University, I think, was officially segregated until about 1976. And even after that, while they allowed a small number of African Americans in, they continued their prohibition on interracial dating until the year 2000, I believe. So there were institutions in this mix that were more racially segregated than others. But even Christianity Today, which at the time in the late 1970s and early 1980s was very publicly in support of racial integration and said that segregation was a sin, nevertheless said that they would stand with Bob Jones University in this case in 1983 because the greater evil was the government trying to tell Christian institutions what to do, that the control of Christian institutions was a greater problem. And I think that helps us understand what was going on, that many of the people who were strongly opposed to the IRS directive, who were even up in arms over this, were not necessarily people who thought that racial segregation was a good thing per se. They just thought that it was a lesser evil than government interference in religion. And they greatly feared government interference in religion. Most of these people had not been strongly supportive of the civil rights movement, to say the least. Some of these people had been strongly opposed to the civil rights movement, like Falwell. It didn't necessarily bother them to take a stance that would have had the long-term effect of continuing racial segregation in society. However, it would be incorrect, I think, to call them segregationists, if by segregationist you mean someone who wanted to see all white institutions that were completely separate from black institutions. And I think more than anything, what was behind this, as I said, was this larger fear that conservative Christianity was under threat. And this was simply one more example of, in their view, of a liberal government attacking the church, attacking Christian schools, and they needed to fight back, in their view.
Racism and segregation played a big role in bonding some evangelicals to the Republican Party. A great many people like Senator John Stennis or Bob Jones wanted to keep the races separate, to continue the nation's historic shame. Some outspoken evangelicals, believing that the IRS was turning schools into secular humanist training camps, used conspiracies to terrify parents. And some evangelicals with large followings worried that private schools would lose their tax-exempt status and, potentially, so would churches, even though there was little proof of that. Others were excited to desegregate schools, so long as it wasn't their kids being transported across town to do it. Then there were integrated Christian schools who wanted to follow the quotas, but couldn't. Finally, the public school students who just wanted a solid education, regardless of the color of their skin. By protesting regulations on tax-exempt status, these evangelicals with large followings tied their cause to segregationists in the minds of many, leaving a long-lasting mark on the name of Christ in the United States, and creating a knot of interests and motivations that is, frankly, hard to untangle, and making all evangelicals look like racists. It was not the issue that brought some evangelicals to the Republican Party, but it is a major reason. Because, as we'll see, Ronald Reagan promised to do away with policies that revoked tax-exempt status from schools. That's the big picture. So, let's bring it to the personal. These episodes should give us pause. All of us. We say that we want equality among the races. We say that these things matter to us. But are we willing to sacrifice to make it happen? Are we okay with our kids spending more time on the bus in order to be around people who don't look like them? When banks were redlining neighborhoods in the North in the 60s and 70s, if an African-American family moved to a white neighborhood, shamefully, the white people often fled. Their excuse was that having a black family in the neighborhood lowered property values. Okay, so white listeners, if you knew that property values were going to fall, would you have the courage to stay? If you knew that your retirement was caught up in the value of your home, would you have the courage to do the right thing and make your neighbors feel welcome, even if it damaged your precious retirement savings? Or how about this? If all churches in the U.S. lost their tax-exempt status for one reason or another, how would it affect your giving if you didn't receive a tax deduction? Are you willing to give to God, even if it means you don't get anything in return? It's easy for us to pay lip service to racial reconciliation. Like David from the start of the show, few of us are willing to give to God that which costs us something. But the Christian faith is all about sacrifice. Jesus died for us while we were yet sinners and told us to do the same. Would you have the courage to put your kids on an integration bus? To stay in your home even if the property values might go down? To give up the tax-exempt status of America's churches if it meant distancing ourselves from segregationists? This legacy of Christian segregation academies is complex, it's ugly, and it's shameful. If we're going to avoid this kind of thing in the future, we can't be okay partnering with wicked people, even if it means that something we enjoy is lost. We need to be willing to do the right thing, even if it requires sacrifice. Special thanks to Rick Perlstein, author of Reaganland and The Invisible Bridge. I'm also indebted to Daniel K. Williams, author of several books, including God's Own Party, which is one of the most readable resources from this season. A major source for this episode was In Search of Another Country, Mississippi and the Conservative Counter-Revolution by Joseph Crespino. You can find a list of my sources on the website and in your show notes, along with discussion questions for most episodes if you want to discuss it with your family or small group. And maybe you've noticed that these last two episodes have wandered a bit. That's because this issue is gigantic, and I really can't fit it all in. There are so many moving pieces in this discussion, and I hope I did it justice. Special thanks to everyone who loaned me their voices for this episode, including Jackie Hart, Chris Sloan, Josh Griffith, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership Podcast. Truce is listener-supported, and these episodes on Segregation Academies took me weeks and weeks to produce. Reading books, looking for original documentation, dwelling on big concepts. And that means a lot of extra time and digging around until I finally found a historian that expressed the consensus opinion on the record. This kind of thing takes time. And if you want to help me continue making thought-provoking, honest podcasts that try to tell the whole story, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. There you can give via credit card, PayPal, check, or Venmo me at Truce Podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC, and God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.